So we're heading into chapter 6, the incarnation, birth, death, resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost. So I suppose we could call this the part that we know, which is what is the biblical narrative of the Gospels and other texts. But I'm going to try and present Steiner's point of view or theories on this. But I thought it might be worthwhile just to have a little quick review of what we need to remember before we head into this, these imaginations, these opinions. Where have we come? So let's have a look. One of the processes that I think is important to remember about taking on these pictures is the idea of pondering. So in the phenomenology that I've been promoting, that pondering is actually just letting the pictures reside in our hearts, and not, just letting them work upon us for some time before rejecting them. 2, Steiner really tries to work within his theological methodology to move from, to start with historical literalism of the gospel text, but then also to come through a process to see if there's a spiritual literalism. How can we take some of these things spiritually, literally, as well as not just contesting them or proving them as an historical literal event, but also as a spiritual literal. So how do we read the text from a spiritual literalism? Then to remember that Steiner's works, it was one of the comments of my examiners that I understate a little bit how heterodox and polydox Steiner's work is. So the word heterodox and polydox might be big words for some people. In other words, they're not orthodox. they don't necessarily overlap entirely with the orthodox position. The heterodox would be in the sense of his thoughts, whereas the polydox is in the belief of the individual, that he really promotes, that the individual take these thoughts on and work them through for themselves. But the heterodox is also that the thoughts stand outside of the orthodox positions most of the time. Then to try and understand what Steiner means, I suppose this is a little bit what we were doing with the last chapter in the pre-earthly deeds, or the sort of pre-existence of Christ. What does Steiner mean by the mystery of Golgotha? So I will just read here. He says, the mystery of Golgotha is the collaborative working of all these beings for the sake of the human self. So we're going to go in these earthly preparations in 6.1 through a number of historical figures who he tries to build into how they, in their destinies, in their cultural impulses, worked for the sake of the human self. And the collaboration between all these beings, including Christ and Jesus, who he then calls the Nathan soul of humanity, or the Adam Katmon of the Kabbalistic tradition, work together for the sake of the human self through history, not just the crucifixion, 2,000 years ago that is in the biblical narrative, but it's a much bigger process that accompanies the unfolding of the human self in history. And the 5th thing, I suppose, is a bit of a disclaimer on Steiner's work, because he can be seen as being a generalist rather than a specific. And he does actually really claim that, what he's talking about and the processes of the evolution of consciousness are in the Mesopotamian cradle, or the cradle of civilization, or we could say Eurocentric. But he acknowledges that other cultures have their contributions to make towards the evolution of humanity. He mentions positive aspects of Polynesian, Indigenous Australian, North American, the Maya and the Mexican cultures. And he points out, different cultures that have contributed in a different way to some of the pictures here, that the sort of the central areas that we've been talking about, which is the sort of the Indian, Persian, Semitic, Eurocentric kind of cultures, Egypt, that kind of area, revolve a lot around this bringing in. So it's, while we're focusing in on that, we shouldn't forget that that's not saying this is how it is for all people of all times, that other cultures also have different processes going on that have contributed to evolution, really. So that's just a bit of a heads up there for that. So let's head into understanding what this how Steiner sees the central idea of Christianity, of mystical fact. He says that the pre-Christian mystery centers took on students and gave secret instruction and preparation towards initiation. In particular, earthly cultural founders who were initiated into the mysteries prepared humanity for the incarnation of Christ. Understanding that Christ was perceived in different pre-Christian cultures is a characteristic feature of Steiner's teaching. It sheds light upon his contribution to Christology. And we're going to focus on 7 of the prominent cultural founder personalities before Christ: Manu, Krishna, Zarathustra, Hermes, Moses, Elijah, and Buddha. So those are sort of turning points in pre-Christian history. Again, if you look at them, where they're all in that Mesopotamian cradle. Who are these people, and how did they participate in the preparation towards the birth of Christ that we read about in the biblical narrative? Augustine, to note, is that he said that what we now call the Christian religion existed amongst the ancients and was from the beginning of the human race until Christ came into the flesh, from which time the already existing true religion began to be styled Christian. So that was Augustine. So recognition that this pre-existence of Christ has been perceived in pre-Christian cultures, in sacred texts. But the question is, how do we read them? I suppose that's where Steiner gives us a bit of a possibility of reading the stories, the narratives of these founders, to understand how this all works. So where are we talking about? When we're talking about the earthly preparations, we're talking about, in Steiner's language, what would be called the post-Atlantean epoch. In evolutionary terms, it would be the post-Ice Age or the Holocene. So probably the last 11,000 years that we're looking at these cultural developments. And that's why we start with Manu, in that sense, who is also in the biblical story Noah. So Noah is the one who brings in an ark the wisdom across from a time before the flood, or we could say in evolutionary terms, in the pre-Holocene epochs. So who is this mythological figure? Manu is the one in Hinduism, or the Vedic culture, is the one who built a boat and brought 7 of the holy rishis across from a pre-flood time. And they were the founders of the Vedanta culture. And Steiner calls this time of the Vedanta culture the ancient Indian epoch. Now, we shouldn't confuse that with the Hindu culture. The Hindu culture emerges, as we know, out of the Vedanta culture. Hinduism actually only emerges as in its own right out of the Vedanta culture about 2,000 years before. We were about 4,000 years ago. It wasn't there prior to that, but it's obviously based and is very synonymous with that Vedanta culture. But you could say that the Hinduism emerges where the Vedanta culture starts to become written down, where it moves from an oral tradition to a textual, with the Mahabharata and things like that. And the Bhagavad Gita within that preserves one of the first pre-earthly deeds of Christ, and that's the figure of Krishna. So this is one of the sort of more difficult or one of the more challenging pictures for us to try and incorporate these pre-earthly figures, where we see that in Steiner's picture, this being of Adam Kadmon was at the time where we have in the biblical story Adam and Eve being expelled from paradise. There is a tradition that a part of the human soul, which was untouched by the earthly conditions, remained within the sun lodge, remained within in the sort of more subtle planes of the spiritual world, and became known as the Nathan soul of humanity in Rudolf Steiner's language. And then Adam Kadmon is the one that holds, we could say, in a superhuman way, the qualities of the human ego. And Krishna, Steiner talks about how Krishna in his conversation with Arjuna is in a way a revelation of this pure ego, of this pure self of the human being, and represents that first pre-earthly deeds of Christ. So we start to see how these teachings specifically provided ways for new connections to the spiritual sun and to prepare humanity for the incarnation of Christ. The pre-Christian mysteries provided symbols and mythologies that reflected the knowledge of Christ's journey to incarnation, appropriate for each step in the evolution of consciousness and perceived by that particular culture. So we have the biblical Noah, the Manu with the 7 holy rishis, bringing a wisdom across from a time before the flood. And then we see how through the various epochs, or the various unfolding times, Steiner then goes from the ancient Vedic culture to a shift in the cultural presence in the ancient Persian culture, where you have the Zaratas, or Zoroaster, and Zarathustra, who was, about 6,000 years before Christ, the founder of the Zoroastrianism. And at the time of the Babylonian captivity, the Hebrew people become influenced by Zarathustra, who's in Steiner's sense, he reckons he is a further incarnation of the original founder of the Babylonian culture. So the Persian culture also brings an understanding of the sun spirit, Ahura Mazdawa, the great sun aura, and we have in that time then also the spirit of darkness, Angra Mainus, or Ariman, which Steiner then picks up in his own language out of that, as he's teaching of the dual nature of the forces of hindrance come from this Persian teaching. So we see then in the Persian time yet another sort of cultural impulse where we move from seeing the sort of the sun logos in Krishna coming very clearly out of the sort of the one revelation of the logos, and then we see the sort of the duality or the dualism entering into through the Persian culture with Ahura Mazdawa, the sun spirit, and the Angra Mainus. So then we see that Steiner talks about this thing of the spiritual economy, where he says in history, where we in any point in history, something that was new. This is the beginning of the next part of the chapter, but I'll bring it in now. He claims that a law prevails in spiritual evolution, whereby every capacity that humanity acquires must have its beginning in one individual. Faculties that are to become common to a large number of people must first appear in one person. I sort of bring that into alignment with Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphic resonance, the influence of morphogenesis upon systems. So the question then becomes, what did the Christ being do in the Jesus of Nazareth's body? What was it that came about through the incarnation of the Sun Spirit into a human body that was there for the first time in the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth? What happens? What happens that? But this was prepared, this incarnation was prepared under the guidance of the Holy Spirit through these cultural epochs. And in that sense of the spiritual what Steiner calls the spiritual economy. When a particular person has developed themselves, say like a Francis of Assisi or what we call saints, when a particular person has ennobled their soul for a particular to a particular refinement, the results of that when they die becomes available in the world ether for human beings to take upon themselves. We'll bring this more in chapter 7. But when Zarathustra died, part of his being was made available to two of his pupils. And the Steiner calls it the etheric body and the astral body. We would call it maybe the life body, the body of life that was refined by his work as an initiate, and his soul become available and bringing knowledge of space and time. And these two parts of his being were given to his two pupils. One became a great teacher of space, in other words, astronomy and geography, and another being became an initiate of understanding the work of the sun spirit through time. And that becomes the seed form for the third epoch, which is the Egyptian, Chaldean, Semitic cultures. And Hermes, who's the founder of the Egyptian culture, and Moses, who is a great leader of the Semitic tradition, not just the Hebrew tradition, but he's a real teacher in the Semitic traditions, become these leaders in the third cultural epoch to help the human beings gain knowledge through understanding how space and time work. And the whole journey, Steiner speaks of the whole journey of Joseph taking the 12 tribes into Egypt, was for these two impulses to become close to each other and learn from each other. And by the time Moses then leaves Egypt under the sort of the leadership of his wife Miriam, they take part of the sort of the Egyptian mysteries with them as a fruitfulness of the Egyptian cultures. We have the same with Abraham. Abraham was very strongly influenced. It's sort of, if you remember, Sarah goes to see Pharaoh, and that's Steiner says an indication that Moses through his wife Abraham through his wife learned about the pharaonic mysteries in that sense. So there's this constant fructifying, I suppose, of the cultures moving in and out of each other. And then we have a sort of a further time in that we see in Greece, he was called Hermes Trismegistus, and the Osiris Isis Horus legend reflects the Trinitarian story of the perception of the sun beings. So then Elijah appears, and we start to see in the period of the kings, Elijah appears where he takes the mysteries from being out in nature to within the human soul. This is the step of building the temple, where when Jesus talks to the woman at the well, we see the Samaritans still have this tradition of being taught to worship on the mountains, but the Jews have gone into the temple, and the temple is a picture of the human ego, the connection of the human self to the sun spirit being now inside the individual. And Elijah is the one who goes, he hears God's voice in the still breath, in the zephyr in the cave, rather than in the volcanoes and the storms. So there's another turning point there with Elijah coming. And then we see the captivity in Babylon, where we see coincides with what's known as the axial age, where we could say the patriarchy really starts to inform the sacred scriptures. So we have Second Isaiah, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Pythagoras, and Buddha. Buddha appears during that time in the captivity in Babylon and starts to bring a different influence into the Brahmanic culture, which is, again, it's a turn from being partly initiated through the blood inheritance to having a path of the individual into the compassion within the individual. And we see in Steiner's work how he then describes through these different Mesopotamian cultures this preparation of humanity, this guidance of humanity, culturally, religiously, spiritually, towards being able to be an individual being who can experience like Paul. Really, Paul becomes one of the first ones who has a sort of a personal experience of the sun being in the earth's light, in the light around the earth. And then we see, this coming back out of the captivity of Babylon. The monotheism appears. I'm not going to labor the points here. Abraham was, I won't go into that, but he was also influenced, obviously, by Melchizedek as well, which has to do with the bread and the wine mysteries, preparing the inner temple of the human being. So that's the first part of chapter 6, is trying to give a brief potted history of the cultural leaders coming out of the leadership of the great Manu, the teaching of the 7 holy rishis, seeding these ideas and guiding humanity and the different cultural leaders. Then we come to the Nativity and the Divine Sophia. So here we come to, I think I wrote here that this is, we see in Steiner taking this spiritual spiritual literalism of the Nativity, where we see the 2 streams of history. So for Steiner, there's 2 streams of history that we need to follow that run parallel to each other, because when the fall happens, we see the earthly Adam and Eve come about, but there's a part of the human being that remains in the spiritual worlds. Now, that's not unique to Steiner. I mean, the Dionysian culture, there's these other where we see the Dionysus being taken up into the thigh of Zeus to come back later, is part of all of these imaginations, where Steiner calls this guidance the Mother Lodge or the Divine Sophia. So the Mother Lodge that is within the Sun being is the Divine Sophia, who holds this Adam Kadmon and who follows the evolution that we've just talked about on the earth as from the spiritual world, and remains untouched, so to say, by the forces of hindrance. They don't, in sort of Christian terms, this Adam Kadmon is untouched by the fall. His soul remains pure as it was before the fall. And then on the earth, Adam and Eve, with that, this Divine Sophia, we could say, is a feminine part of that Adam Kadmon's being. And this is where we need to sort of bring the whole idea of syzygy. So in other words, we've got the Christ and Sophia working together as 2 parts. So it's a heresy that Steiner's trying to bring back into a more contemporary, maybe in a more clearly defined expression, where it doesn't lead to strange behaviors on the earth, if possible, as the early Gnostics might have done. So we see that, and the way Steiner goes about describing this is describing the two birth narratives of Matthew and of Luke as 2 different stories. They're not just versions of the same story. And he takes a lot of time to go into that, but he just talks about these how, if you follow the genealogies, the Luke genealogy is not part of the birth story as it is in Matthew, and it's a lot longer. It goes back to God through Adam, whereas Matthew's goes from David through David, and there's a separation in both of them at David. One becomes a Solomon stream, and the other follows the Nathan stream from Solomon. So David and Nathan, from David, Solomon, and Nathan follow these 2 genealogies, and we could say this is the priestly and the kingly stream that was in the Essenes, expectation of the Messiah. So there is a dual messianic expectation in the Jewish Essene community, which has been Barbara Turing explored that in her book Jesus the Man, that there was this double messianic expectation coming out of the Babylonian captivity. And Steiner follows that through and suggests that these were 2 different families, that in the Luke infancy narrative, we have the incarnation for the first time in history, the incarnation of this divine Nathan's soul that is very naive and very pure, and that Mary in herself is also in that story of a nature that hasn't been to the earth before. So very beautiful, under the guidance of the light of Buddha and of Krishna. This history has a guidance of all these great beings bringing the soul to the earth for the first time, whereas the kingly stream of the Matthew story is an incarnation of Adam, who has spent many incarnations on the earth, becoming very, very wise. So learning everything from the engagement with the physical world around us, and that through these two streams, they eventually become one. So there's a unique story in Luke of the 12-year-old in the temple. And Steiner says this story is where that Luke child changes in wisdom and stature in the community, and is where he sees that the Matthew Jesus actually dies and offers his self into a mysterious sort of combination of these two beings to become one being. So what was separated at the fall now becomes one again. And the two Mary figures also play a role in guiding this. So I do acknowledge that this is a very completely outside of the orthodox way of seeing things. As I say in my PhD, when I first read this, I had to put the book down and sort of had to spend 10 years before I came back to have another look at it, because it was just so outside of my comfort zone, so outside of everything that I had understood about anything in the Christian tradition. But, you know, the more I've approached it, I start to see that this actually makes a lot of sense from the point of view of when we come to it, when we see what redemption is, what grace is, what salvation is, what resurrection is. We see that this starts possibly to make more sense. But again, you see in the Matthew story, you know, they lived in Bethlehem. There were the three kings. In the Luke story, they're the three shepherds, but they've traveled from Nazareth. There's just so many differences in the stories. If we read them slowly and take all the details in, you can start to see that possibly there's something to this that makes sense, because what the thing that it does is it makes sense, and it makes sense of preparing a human vessel out of the pure soul of the human being and the wise body of the human being coming together to create a vessel to then receive the Christ at the baptism. So I'm not going to go further into that, but we also see, just to bring the Sophianic side in more clearly, Luke's gospel indicates the role of Mary plays in Sophia at work in the redeeming of the human soul. So, you know, orthodoxy would say that, you know, the redemption of the human soul came through Christ on the cross. But we also see, if we understand these stories, that the transformation in Mary as the representative of Sophia on the earth also plays a role in this being able to help the transformation or the redemption of the human soul. So the connection appears in the story of the mother of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And Steiner says the remaining two families join together. So when you know, the Matthew child has died and the Luke father also dies, these two families land up in Nazareth together, and they become one family. The Matthew family, Jesus has siblings, whereas the Luke child doesn't, and they suddenly create this new, the Holy Family, so to say, where these two streams in history become one on the earth again. So let me just see what else I might bring in for that, just as a way of, for me, this is a kind of a recapping of some of the principles we talked about last time, which we discussed, which is the principle of separation and metamorphosis. You know, separation needs to happen for consciousness to appear, but also how do we read mythology? You know, how do we read mythology? do we bring in the spiritual literalism as well? So there's some really, just on a short process, some really big ideas about the incarnation of Christ. I'm seeing that I'm going a long time here. I wanted to get to the 6.3, which is the missing years, because next time we'll talk about the actual work of the Christ in Jesus. But in the biblical narrative, we have the 12-year-old child in the temple. And then the next sentence is 18 years later when he goes to see the Baptist. There's 18 years missing in the narrative. So what happened in those 18 years? And Steiner claims that he had some insights, that he had some spiritual revelations, that he could see into what is called the Akasha Chronic, or the cosmic memory, about those 18 years. And he describes how this new being, this child now, who was the amalgamation of the naive soul of Jesus and the wise soul body of Jesus, travel around. And there's a lot of stories now emerging that Jesus possibly went to Tibet or India to be taught by a Tibetan master. There's stories of him appearing in England, possibly even in America. Steiner talks about these 3 6-year periods where he confronts 3 different mystery centers, we could say. So he hears in his own Jewish community how the rabbis had lost the capacity to hear the inspiring voice of the Jewish people. What he calls it, the Bath Kol, the voice, the feminine voice of the spirit that was part of how the people, the voice of revelation. And in his experience as that 12-year-old, where he sat down and they interpreted the gospel, the texts for the rabbis, and they were astounded at his wisdom. He got this deep sadness because he realized his own culture had kind of lost its connection to revelation. Then he also has an experience of the Mithraic pagan culture, where he goes and visits these pagan cultures, but he also has an experience of them having lost the content of their rituals, that the rituals no longer held the priests could no longer hold the rituals in a way that could bring the guidance to the people, and that created within him a suffering about humanity as well. And then in the third sense, he also had an experience with the Essene community, where he experienced the Essene community withdrawing from the rest of humanity for the sake of perfection. And that, he said, was, he felt this was not to become the path for the human being, to seek perfection by isolation. And that would be one of the critiques of the Gnostics in a way. And then he talks about this at 29, after the 18 years, just before the baptism. Steiner describes him seeing Christ having a 3-day conversation with his mother, expressing his deep suffering for humanity. And she takes on the way she listens to the conversation, transforms her soul as well. It said, the profound pain has the power to change into love, a love greater than the ordinary kind of love where you merely have to be there with your love. This love streamed out like the far-reaching rays of an aura. So the way she listened transformed his suffering into love, which was important for receiving the Christ. But Mary, at the same time, feels a profound meaning of these words, a meaning full of suffering, but also filled with the profound love of humanity entered her soul. And she felt inwardly strengthened by a power that came from him. And she felt her soul was changing. And that's then picked up in the Gospel of John, how the mother and Jesus work together. It's a story that's written into the Gospel of John, how the mother of Jesus and Jesus work together to bring about this transformation. So yeah, the transformation of Mary and the baptism in the Jordan are 2 really important experiences that Rudolf Steiner asks us to consider. So he really brings in strongly the role of Sophia and Mary as a co-work, in a way, Simeon's prophecy of, the 7 swords will pierce your soul too, or the swords of sorrow, a sword of sorrow will pierce your soul too. And he tries to build that in to try and bring us, so that's where I'm going to end for today on explaining. I know that's halfway through, but I thought it would just be good for us to get to that point, and I think we should enter into some dialogue.
Once again, thanks so much for that, Jude. It's so rich what you're giving us. It's so rich that it's really difficult to know even where
Ready to start, yeah.
to begin. As usual, I've got a long list of things that I'd like to reflect on and select raise, but I'd like to encourage other people who are less familiar with this material. So if there are questions, or if you feel yourself like responding strongly to anything that Jude has said, so like please I try and voice that, because that's where the value comes. Don't know if Raynand or Craig or Nicola, you've got anything you'd like to say, add, or ask, Jude?
I'm still only on year 2 of my 10 years waiting to make sense. So.
Well, I know we've had a few quick, lively discussions about how confronting this idea is. Yeah.
Yes.
But perhaps we can actually start there, because this is
I think that's a good place to start. Yeah.
Because we live in you right at the beginning of our talk today, you talked about the importance of pondering, and if you could, I'd like you to really dig down a little bit into if using my language here, it's the trappings of intellectualism versus the living into the life of the idea. Because our culture tends to emphasize this intellectuals, I got it intellectually and that's enough. But with your experience, you're indicating that there's another truth that we really need to get hold of here. And we have to, like we do as kids, we take these stories, and not necessarily these stories, but also other stories, as truths, and we live with them. It's in an emotional way. And they gain a type of strength within us. They become a force that lives within our soul. And this is something that a large part of, the more intellectual we are, the more likely it is we lose that capacity. Would you like to add something there, Jude?
Look, Steiner's approach to anthroposophy, or his teachings, or his revelations, we call them, is it's very hard to understand it all with the intellect. But he says when you're listening to these things, one of the ways to approach it is is your heart saying somewhere yes, and then maybe the intellectual agreement will or won't emerge later on. But if your heart isn't saying yes, you're not going to sort of, as Nicola said, spend 2 or 3 years just living with it and seeing what fruit comes from it. So somewhere the heart needs to be there first before the intellectual detail is understood in full. And that's what took me that long. At first was just nah, these guys are crazy. And it just took me long. Sorry. Anyway, Craig.
No comprendo.
Did you want to say something, Craig?
I was just going to say, so Nicola shared she was on year 2. I think I'm coming up to year 4. And sort of my background was sort of, I had 12 years Catholic education. And by the time I'd gotten through that, I was sort of, I'm done now. I'm out of that world. And I kind of found my way back in through a little bit of Eastern spirituality, and then came across Steiner's work, and really initially struggled with, not this concept because this came later, but really initially struggled with just how Christ-centric his work was. And then, sort of doing a study course with Jude, came across this concept of the 2 Jesus children, and I just remember just this feeling of my head exploding, but at the same time, something a bit to what you were talking about, Angus, is just this, you know, almost like a drawing towards the possibility of this being true. Particularly when I was able to reconcile it with the fact that, you know, I wasn't paying attention for the whole 12 years, but it was never mentioned to me. It was all just mashed into one big story with the manger and, you know, the kings and all of those sorts of things was my recollection of it. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey to, you know, live, like Jude, you talk about living with the concept of something being true to allow something else to emerge. And that's really, you know, the ongoing journey that I'm sort of working with these concepts. So I just thought that was worthwhile sharing.
Yeah.
From my end as well, I'm still so I read the different pages there, and to be honest, I'm trying to reconcile. It's quite profound, you know, from the skeptical, you know, from this, for example, if you're coming from the scientific lens, like, what? How? Like, it does not make sense at all from, you know, basing from the scientific perspective, but it's highly profound. Like, for example, it's quite interesting that if I'm not mistaken, and if I understand it right, Saint Augustine mentioned about true religion existed before the physical incarnation of Christ. So, like, that's an interesting topic. Like, in what particular sense? So somehow, looking at the biblical understanding, you're trying to reconcile everything. So it's quite huge. Profound. Yeah.
It's huge. Yeah.
I mean, I can cope with that. You know, true religion before Christ. Let's see, multiple Christs, say. You know, I mean, I understand the feeling of really wanting to believe something and just being attracted to it, you know, in your heart. Yeah. It's just that doesn't happen with this.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Could I make a point on a specific choice of words that Raymond used there? Raymond, sorry, not Raymond. Raymond. The scientific perspective can't accept it. I want to call that into question. Or let's be a bit more specific. The materialistic scientific perspective cannot accept it because the spirit doesn't exist. But if your scientific perspective is, let's use the Bible or the Gospels in this case as documents, and out of that we're going to draw all of our conclusions, then actually it's like something really strange happens. A little bit later, in the part that Jude covered today, he said the complexity, where have I've highlighted it? He talks about the complexity of Steiner's narrative suggests that blah, 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 blah. The thing is with complexity is things are only complex until we really understand them, and then they're dead simple.
Yeah.
And this is one of these sort of, again, one of these mysteries, and I think we might have even talked about it in a previous conversation. Once that light goes on, it's sort of like, how did I not know this? How did I not see this before? And just to take one trivial example from what you mentioned today, Jude, how did I not notice that 18 years of his life are missing? I mean, this is surely important. But when we really work from a spiritual scientific perspective out of these profound documents, we realize they are fully reconcilable with the narrative that Steiner's giving them. And the apparent complexity disappears because our understanding has reached a new level. Conceptually, we are more mature. We've got the concepts living within us that allow us to read this material. And instead of experiencing confusion, it's sort of like, wow. It becomes a deep inner profound experience instead of which you nicely described, Nicola. It's sort of like, it doesn't do anything for me. It's like this, and that's a normal human reaction.
Yeah.
It's just that I think that the incarnation itself is so extraordinary and so much to ponder.
Yeah,
You know, that
absolutely.
it's like extra stuff.
Yeah. I remember when I was a young minister, I was in a community, and this one guy, he grew up Catholic and was practicing Buddhist now, and he came to he liked me. He came to a few of my sessions about gospel studies or something, and eventually he said, what's different about Steiner's approach to the whole Christ thing? And so I told him the story. I spent an hour telling you everything I've just said now. And he listened, he really listened deeply. And he said, so it's the same story, just more complex. I said, so deflated, thinking I'd given him this great revelation, just made it more complex for him. And he said, I'm not convinced yet. Yeah, it's very
perhaps
complex.
to build on the point that Nicola was making, so like the mystery of the incarnation, so like the 33 years as being enough for an average person to deal with. I want to add in like another fact, which you've hinted at already here, Jude, which I think can give a sense of how the mystery really can grow. It's already big, but it can.
Yep.
It's infinite, just like God. You were talking about like moving, so like the Vedantic wisdom brought over by Manu, that became Hinduism, and then Hinduism is obviously, it's the roots of Buddhism. It's the philosophical underpinnings of Buddhism. But something very interesting actually happened in Buddhism at and around the time of Christ's incarnation, and I don't know whether we have talked about it or whether I have recently read it, but I think I'll share it with the group here, because this is how this mystery opens up. So one of the things that we can learn is that Buddhism itself experienced some profound changes, so like at the same time as Christ was going on. And you've got this Mahayana stream in Buddhism that develops itself, which is the concept of the, and I'd love it if Jude can fill in more details here, of it's like the bodhisattvic nature of our existence. It's like we are eternal beings that are on the path of progress. Buddha was a reincarnation of, he had existed many times before, and that individual reaches it's like a higher state of being, raises consciousness. In the context of this conversation, it's like conceptually he matures. And one of the fruits of this Mahayana stream is this idea of the bodhisattvic renunciation of nirvana. So not wanting to escape from earth and leave all the problems behind. But there's this idea that the bodhisattvic oath, I believe it is called, is that we will remain on earth, just like Christ, until all the souls are redeemed. So this Christ being becomes something that the event itself, it's like happens there. It's like on Calvary, on the hill of Golgotha. But its effects, they're manifesting themselves already. So at that time. And then again, we could look at history, other parts of history, and see how this impulse is growing and growing and growing, apparently outside of Christianity. But it's not, if we've got a larger concept of what Christ really is.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole lot of things there that could be said. I mean, also that, Buddhism in a way disappears from India and only sort of comes back in the 4th century through the Chinese, through the Monkey King. And that it's got its whole transformation there as well. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely a huge transformation that, that you see again in that sense of that morphic resonance, is that if one person fulfills a realization, it will affect other cultures, and it would be interesting to track that through other cultures. So, for example, in the Australian Aboriginal culture, there are some nations where they tell the story of the Sky Father coming down to the earth to bring the law, Lore, of how to live on the earth, and then goes back to the sky and leaves his son on earth to be the sort of the holder of the law, which is a similar sort of transformative picture of handing over where the law is held from the father to the son, kind of thing. And question is, how old is that version of that story? I mean, everyone claims it's an ancient story, but it might not be as old as we think it is. That particular evolution of that particular story. So we do see evolutions in global as a result of things. I don't think it's surprising. And as you say, Christ fulfilled that himself. I mean, he became enlightened at the transfiguration. And then Moses and Elijah encourage him not to ascend.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes back and fulfills, the fulfillment on the cross. That's the mystery. I mean, that's the deepest mystery, is that there is the crucifixion. And I think, Nicola's point, and she keeps coming back to this, and it's always the one that I think is most relevant, is, and Stephen, who was my other supervisor for many years in this, they both said, well, what is this? How does this help anybody? Surely, having that simple, singular focus on the mystery of the incarnation and the redemption of the human soul through grace and resurrection is enough. The faith in that is enough. Why would you? What does it actually help to pad it out? To expand it in this way? Does it actually add anything to the person of faith? In a way, theologically, intellectually, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful.
I mean, I think the stuff about other cultures, I think that helps. I get that.
Yeah.
And about one person having a sort of morphic resonance, that's plausible too. I mean, unfortunately, it works for bad things as well.
Absolutely.
Right-wing stuff,
Yeah, it does, absolutely, yeah. But yeah, and Stephen, when he read the whole thing, because he was a Catholic professor, and he was my sort of he was my dean of my master's course, and we had long conversations over many years about anthroposophy, and he had, at the end he said, I've had Steiner in a corner, and through wrestling with what you've kind of brought him out into the open for me. And he said, but even then, this thesis is helpful for people like you, who this is not going to become mainstream theology. It's helpful for people who have a particular interest or a particular disposition towards wanting to understand things from this sort of esoteric, mystical point of view, and then it's very helpful. But
and yet, if it didn't have this bit, it would probably be more helpful in some ways.
I remember you saying that. Like, why bring this in? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
I can answer that.
Complexity.
Oh, you can answer that. Okay.
Yeah, it's not sufficient. Just the mere stating a dogmatic statement that this is the word of God, I don't buy it unless somebody comes with more evidence to support that. So somebody with somebody coming from like a scientific, initially atheistic perspective, it actually begins to look at the reasoning going on here and says, there is a consistent logic. The inconsistencies that I see in theological debates, that is resolved for me here.
How,
Yeah,
And
I have
so
that
so
experience.
how's
can
it?
I'd like to sort of like just build on that,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
and this is also an aspect of the spiritual economy you were talking about, Jude, earlier, because it's not so like one seed generates another two seeds, another two seeds generate four seeds, and another four seeds generate eight seeds. There are always going to be people in whatever stream, good or bad, we assume this is good here, that are going to be at the forefront, that are going to be doing this type of work, so that other people, other souls, when they feel confronted by the same type of doubts that I experienced, are able to overcome those doubts.
Craig, you've got your hand up.
I understand we are running out of time, but going back to your lecture earlier, we can hang on there and we can discuss this probably next time. But it appears to me that Steiner is trying to teach the pre-Christian presence of Christ, and it seems to me that Christ was perceived in different forms back before his birth, I think. And
Yep.
I remember looking at the news a few weeks ago, there was this inter-religion dialogue in Singapore, and Pope Francis mentioned that all religions, there are different religions, but it's like a path to reach God, like
Yeah, he did.
different forms, but to converge at the end, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Craig, you wanted to say something?
Oh, we may be out of time, but my question relates back to the two Jesus again, and a bit to what Nicola was talking about is, so we've seen throughout history of Christianity where things have been changed or written out for particular reasons, declared heresy, or whatever the case may be. We've seen the kind of the transition from, the threefold aspect to two. What was this known, like the two Jesus, and avoided for a particular reason, or was it like? And there's a I guess a material question to that, but there's also what's the spiritual impulse of keeping this not widely known?
Yeah. Steiner would, I think, go down the track of saying it was known in esoteric circles, and that we I think I bring it up in some of the chapters of that. Why did we get a sort of a drive into an exoteric Christianity and an esoteric Christianity? Why was that schism necessary? I think I brought that up in the reincarnation chapter, that there were certain things about reincarnation that needed to be kept in secret or occulted or esoteric for a time. And Steiner then felt it was time for this now to become general knowledge again because of the age that we're now living in. I don't know whether they are documents to prove that or not. But he certainly goes down the fact that it was occulted often in art. So you can follow it through in especially the medieval or the Dark Ages, how that was kept as a knowledge through the artworks, say, of Leonardo da Vinci and others. Raphael in particular indicates that. Yeah.
Could I add something there? I know we are running short of time, but it's an alternative. This isn't a contrary answer. This is an alternative answer to your question, Craig. Is one way to understand it is I'm going to use an image from The Wizard of Oz, where it's like, you've all seen the film, yeah? I guess it's. No, so she finally finds the wizard behind the curtain there, and the wizard she's like the master, the guru is going to take her home, but he doesn't take her home. He's like crashes and burns, and she has to find her own way home. One way of understanding this is like withholding of knowledge is so that we don't become dependent on gurus and masters that we actually develop this like interior capacity ourselves. So that is the birth of the true I. I am the authority that is bound by truth. Could be another way of understanding, why did they hide these things? Because it would be easy for like just like somebody, here's the answer, everybody go believe it, and they just believe it and that's enough. But then you don't have your freedom. Then you haven't developed your will. It becomes a very different proposition of what love is.
Yeah, that's
imagine if there was two people behind the curtain, though, Angus.
There's more than two.
Yeah. Well, just to finish off, I one of the things that when I do teach these things is I always say these are rentable ideas. Right? You put them in your mind, put them in your heart, rent them for a while, ponder them. If you don't like them, send them back to the owner.
It's a really good concept. I like that one, Jude.
Yeah. It's like you don't have to believe this, but at least chew on them for a while, 10 years if you need. Yeah. And I mean that's the same with any science, really. You have to actually chew on the ideas to come to an understanding of the more complex, even in physics or maths. You actually have to digest the principles, but sometimes we just can't digest them, or we do digest them and say, actually, you know what, no, I don't think this is right. That's our sort of our process of theology, really, where every person, I mean, in experienced theology, we sort of move along the process of you have your experience first, and then your secondary theology is coming to explain it. So theologica prima is the experience of something. That's why this heart experience is so important. And then we take a secondary process where I, as a theologian, try to make meaning of my experience. It's an important method for anthroposophy as well. Can we sort of touch that as an experience or as a possible reality and then chew on it? That's that pondering.
What kind of worship did Steiner do?
He grew up Roman Catholic in Austria.
But
and
as
then
an adult.
As an adult, he there was a time where he was with the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons. I think there was a time before 1900 where he was very strongly influenced by the Nietzschean whole process of and the German idealisms of this sort of polydox. It's really the process of the individual wrestling to find their relationship with the divine, and therefore in that sense a Pauline kind of approach of my experience is my teacher. I'm convinced because I've experienced it. He then was involved obviously with the founding of a church, the Christian community, but he never attended it.
Funny.
Yeah, he didn't actually become a member of that church. He was buried by that church, but he didn't attend the services. Yeah, interesting.
And then there is his version, his own personal version of the Lord's Prayer, which he recited every day.
So you could call it Bhakti Hinduism. He had his own personal devotion. Yeah. Yeah. He was very devout, and he prayed that. Yeah, exactly. And he meditated, we could say. Yeah. But yeah, he wasn't part of a formal religious community. Yeah. Okay, everybody. Thanks for the lively discussion.
Thank you, Jude.
Thank you.
Next time's easier because Jesus and Christ become one after the baptism. Yeah, we can stick to the one experience. Yeah. Okay.